what? Sorry, the dog is looking at me like I'm cray, which is true because I seem like I'm talking to myself, but I'm actually talking to you. Here we go. Okay, so nails. This is the first mass-produced fastener. Nails were originally forged individually by like a blacksmith or whatever, just like everything else. But then they got into the industrial age and they figured out that you could cut nails out of sheets of metal much more quickly and then have lots and lots of nails for constructing things. Our modern contemporary nails are produced from wire stock that's different thicknesses. So your nail sizes originate from how much they would cost. The thicker and heavier nails would be like a 16 penny nail, which referred to the cost of 100 nails or something. I don't know. Read it in the book, and you too will know what the story about the penny for the nails would be. The head of a nail is helping to sort of lock the thinner piece of wood to the thicker piece of wood. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's the picture of the types of nail heads, but I actually put this on the next slide. So let's move on to the next slide. So you have different types of nail heads that have different purposes. So your standard nail head is just going to keep the nail into the wood. Your duplex nails are designed so that you can hammer them in, and then that top nail head is easier to grab when you're trying to pull the nail out. And then a finish nail has a much smaller head. And as you can see, it has like a little divot in the center of it. So a finish nail is intended to be buried into the wood. So you, like if you're hammering it in, you would hammer it in flush, and then you would use a nail set to tap it in a little bit further. That finish nail can then have the hole that it went in puttied or otherwise filled so that you get a smooth finish and it doesn't look like there's even a nail there. So a lot of like furniture will have a finish nail situation going on. Any nails that we're driving with a pneumatic nail gun, which is the way that we are more likely to put nails in the modern time. In our shop for sure, we're much more likely to be putting a nail in with a pneumatic nail gun than with a hammer. And those nails will come in these nice long strips that are sort of attached together with usually it's kind of like a plastic strip structure that holds them all aligned so that they'll just go right into the right alignment with the nail gun, and then the air pressure can bang, 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 knock the nails straight where we want them to go. So those are your pneumatic nail gun nails. Staples and finish nails are also generally driven by a pneumatic nail gun. So these are much thinner wire fasteners, and they're more likely to be used in a situation where we really need the staple or the nail to hold two materials together while the glue dries. So glue is going to be stronger than the staple or the nail. And so generally anytime we're using staples to attach one thing to another thing, we're also going to be using them in conjunction with glue because the glue is what's actually going to hold the joint. The staple is more like a clamp that's holding that together until that glue dries and makes that joint solid. There's a little diagram about how to pick a staple or a nail that doesn't stick out in order for it to be the most useful one. You can also see that the staples and nails will generally go in a little bit deeper than the surface of the wood, and that's because we're driving them with a pneumatic nailer. So screws and bolts. The thing they have in common is that they both use a spiral thread to hold materials together, whether that's a screw that's using a spiral thread as it drills into a material like wood, or a bolt that's using a spiral thread to lock a nut on one side of it, or to tighten into another receptacle. A small bolt, a thinner bolt, or a smaller bolt is sometimes called a machine screw, and that's because it would be used on something like a smaller machine, something like that, which you don't need to drill into the way you do with a regular screw. So machine is a reference to the type of thread. That'll be a denser thread typically than your screws, which are going to be a wider thread because they're trying to grab onto that material as you drill into it. You'll match the head of your screw to your screwdriver. So you'll look at the screw type that you have, and you'll go find the slotted screwdriver, or the Phillips screwdriver, or the square drive screwdriver. This is all stuff we talked about before when we talked about screwdrivers and hand tools. The screw most commonly used by us in scenic construction is a drywall screw. There are also wood screws, which are similar to a coarse drywall screw, which is what the photograph is a picture of. So a coarse thread drywall screw has pretty wide threads. A finer thread drywall screw is more like the drawing version here. We'll usually use coarse thread drywall screws to attach different materials together or put hinges on things on a flat or something like that. They're going to be very commonly used for us because we can take them out again and reuse the materials for another purpose. Self-tapping screws are used for attaching metal to metal or sheet metal to wood or wood to metal, like if you needed to put a facing on a steel frame, you would use a self-tapping screw, which is called a Tek screw. It's also sometimes spelled T-E-K. That's the brand name, so that's the Kleenex of the Tek screw. The self-tapping screw has a drill bit on the bottom of it, and then the threads are just like the threads on any other screw. And then the head of that screw is often a hex drive head, because you will need to put a lot of pressure to do the drilling portion, the drill bit on the end of that screw, which is why it's self-tapping, because it's creating its own hole. So that may require a hex drive. You can also get some smaller Tek screws with a regular Phillips drive on them, so that you don't have to go get a hex drive head for your screw gun. But both are an option, and that's going to be used whenever we're talking about attaching wood to metal or metal to metal. Here's some more bolts that we might encounter. So your standard bolt is a hex-headed bolt with a nut that screws onto it, and it will create a bolt set, right? So a bolt would be like the hex-headed threaded piece with the flat end. The nut is the little hexagon with the hole in it that you would screw onto that bolt. A carriage bolt is different because a carriage bolt, rather than having a hex head, has a rounded top. So it's like a smooth rounded top head and then a square shaft. That carriage bolt we will sometimes use on something like a platform where it's going to lock into where the square section of the shaft would lock into the side of the platform, and then the hex bolt would be tightened onto it. The hex nut would be tightened onto that bolt. A lag bolt is kind of a cross between a bolt and a screw. It's generally a heavier shaft than a regular screw, so it's a thicker piece of metal. It has a pointy end on it, like a screw, even though we call it a lag bolt. But it has a hex head that's more like a standard bolt. So in scale, it's more of a bolt-sized thing than a screw-sized thing. But the pointy end means that you can use it to attach together things that are bigger and require more strength than a standard screw. So if I'm trying to attach a piece of scenery to the floor, and I want it to be relatively permanent, it needs to be under some stress, I'll use a lag bolt because that's going to be a stronger connection than a regular screw. And it will allow me to go into a material without having to go all the way through it and put a nut on the other side, the way a regular bolt would. We got some other kinds of bolt heads. So you can have square bolt heads that I encounter most frequently as that square bolt on the pipe bolt of the C-clamp. For the most part, I don't run into a lot of other square bolt heads. Most bolts will have a hex head. Some cases you'll find a hex nut or a square nut. So that's going to be Same shape with the hole in it and the female threads that will lock onto those bolts. You'll have flat washers, you'll have tooth washers, you'll have a split ring washer, which is also known as a lock washer. That will help keep, you can use a split ring washer or a lock washer to help keep a bolt and nut from loosening over time. So that's what those are for. And then you have your wing nut, which looks like a little butterfly, and that tightens down using your fingers as opposed to using a wrench or a nut driver. Here's the last slide I have for you on this, which is a guide to choosing fasteners, which is coming through a little blurry. But the basic idea is a nail is easy to install, right? Especially with a nail gun, a pneumatic nail gun, very quick to install it. It would tend to work loose over time. You can kind of pull against a nail and it'll tend to come loose. A staple is a great choice for a thin material, particularly if you're holding together two pieces of material while glue dries. Drywall screws have more holding power than a nail and can still be easily removed. You just put your screw gun in reverse and pull that sucker right out. A bolt is more secure than any other fastener, especially if you're using a washer. That'll keep the nut from working loose. So that's really important. And then a lag bolt is for use with large dimension lumber. So that's stuff like 2x stock as opposed to 1x stock. And also if you're like needing to go into 4x4s or something like that. So that's when you'll use a lag bolt. You'll also use it for connecting scenery to the floor. I think that's it. I think that's all I have. Great. Awesome. Okay, so that's fasteners.